As you work with views, you'll notice that you interact with models and you have to use special code to do this. And there has to be special code to take a model and sort of mush it into a view so that you can work with it. And the way this is done is with mechanisms called view engines, or the logic behind the scenes that allows you to put code in your views and have it do different things. There are two main view engines that sort of come out of the box. They are not the only view engines you can use for MVC. You can actually wire up any view engine that you want if there's one out there that you like better. But there's two that come straight out of the box, and I'd like to talk about those for a minute. The first one is the Razor view engine. This one was appropriated for MVC relatively quickly, and it's because it has a nice lightweight syntax. It's very clean. It integrates well with the HTML. It uses the @ sign to introduce Razor code. So if you're looking at a view and you see the @ sign followed by something that doesn't quite look like text or HTML, then you know you're probably looking at Razor code. This also tends to be the popular choice for new MVC applications. In fact, if you go online and you look for code samples or you download MVC projects, the odds are extremely good that they're all going to be using Razor for the view engine. So whether you're new to MVC development or whether you're coming from an ASP.NET background, it really behooves you to learn the Razor view engine and that way of doing things, because I think you'll find that it's easier to work with, it feels more native to the MVC framework, and almost all your reference materials are going to be using Razor. However, you don't have to use Razor. In fact, out of the box, the MVC framework also supports web forms. Now, these web forms do not operate the way web forms do in regular .NET web forms development. There's still no code behind or no postbacks or anything like that. But the same syntax you use in web forms to introduce code, you can also use those as a view engine in MVC. So web forms is going to use the typical ASP syntax, and it's going to use the % signs to delimit code, and it's going to use all of your traditional ASP code functions. So the way you normally write code out in ASP, the for loops and the if statements and all that, that's how you're going to want to do it if web forms is your view engine. But I also want to point out that you can use other view engines. MVC is very extensible that way, so if you like Spark or any of the other view engines that are out there that you might like better, you can wire those up into the MVC framework and it will use your preferred view engine. These view engines are just set up to come right out of the box. I'm going to spend most of my time focused on Razor, just because that is by far and away the most popular. If you already know web forms, then you don't need to learn about it. And if you aren't familiar with web forms, I really wouldn't learn it just for the sake of doing MVC applications, because Razor is probably where you want to go. The most common way we see Razor is in something called code nuggets. Code nuggets are inline, so what happens is you'll look at a view and interspersed with the HTML, you'll find your Razor code. It's kind of similar to classic ASP. So those of you who remember classic ASP pages, you remember we had HTML pages basically, and here and there you would stick your ASP code. Now sometimes people see that and they say, well, aren't we kind of moving backwards here? I thought the whole point was to get more decoupling. And that's true, but keep in mind that your Razor code is only concerned with display. Unlike classic ASP, you're not going to have these blocks of code where you're hitting the database and the page isn't doing all this programmatic stuff. All that stuff is decoupled and isolated. You're only going to find logic that has to do with display, which is exactly the concern of the view. These code nuggets are going to begin with the @ sign. And sometimes at this point people say, well, what if I want to put an email address in my HTML or something like that? Won't that get interpreted as Razor? Well, the good news is the parser is not easily confused. It knows common situations. If it sees an @ sign followed by Razor code, then it will probably try to parse it as Razor. But if it sees @ signs just kind of out in the wild or as part of email addresses or part of a string of text, it's pretty good about knowing that that is not Razor code. However, if for some reason you're doing something complicated and you get to a point where the Razor parser is confused, you can just put your code nugget in parentheses and then it will know for sure that that's actually code that needs to be parsed. Another kind of code nugget that we see a lot are HTML helpers. Now, this is sort of trying to bring in a little bit of the functionality of your ASP.NET Web Forms control in the sense that you can use HTML helpers to generate HTML. So for example, if I want to create a hyperlink that will call up a particular controller and a particular action and pass it a particular ID, I can use an HTML helper and pass those in as parameters and it will generate the hyperlink for me. However, one thing I do want to point out is that even if you use HTML helpers, and you don't have to use a single HTML helper if you don't want to, but if you do use them, you can still pass it an array of HTML properties so that it can write out the HTML attributes that you want as opposed to generating them all on its own. And you can write your own HTML helpers so you can override the outputs of those HTML helpers. So here I'm looking at the About view. It's a default view that's generated by the MVC project in Visual Studio. It's underneath the Home subfolder, so you know this goes with the Home controller. And this is just kind of a simple view, which is mostly HTML, but you can also see the Razor code nuggets. Here's a code nugget, for example, where it writes the title out of the view bag. Here's a code nugget where it writes out the view bag message. Now, one thing I want to point out to you is notice that there's a period here, and this period will actually display at the end of the title because the Razor parser is smart enough to know, hey, there's no extra properties out here, so this must not be Razor code, this must be actual text. So that's what allows us to do things like add more text to the end of a Razor code nugget or something because the parser's smart enough to figure out, hey, this is not valid Razor code, so that must be text that it wants to display. But if for some reason I was confusing the parser, then I could put parentheses around my Razor code like this, and then the problem solved. I also want to point out down here at the bottom some of those HTML helpers. So here's an example where what we want at the bottom is a hyperlink that will use this controller and this action and display this text. So what you've got here are these HTML helpers. Notice they are Razor code. It's the action link helper, and I'm going to give it the text, the action name, and the controller name. And what this will do is produce for me hyperlink code that will invoke this controller's action when you click on it. So when I look at the About view in the browser, okay, so here's my view bag title. There's that period that was at the end. The parser was smart enough to recognize that was text. Here's the view bag message. Here's some other stuff, and here are those links. And notice these are hyperlinks, just HTML hyperlinks that got generated by those HTML helpers. If I view the source code, you can see those HTML helpers created exactly the URLs I needed to invoke those controllers and those actions. Sometimes as we work with views, and we work with Razor code that might be pulling in data from the view bag or the model or a view model that we've constructed, sometimes you'll come across characters that if they were just displayed on the page, they would really mess HTML up. For example, you have the less than sign and the greater than sign. If you just drop a less than sign into the middle of an HTML page, it's going to mess your browser up because it thinks it's the beginning of an HTML tag. Or for that matter, maybe my website is actually about HTML, and so I want to display HTML tags on the page, and I don't want to mess the browser up. Well, what you need to do when you have special characters that could interfere with the browser is you want to encode them so that they will display properly. Now, the good news is that anything you have coming out of a Razor statement, it is automatically going to encode your HTML. And you will see the HTML character references for those characters that might mess up a web page. But sometimes that may not be exactly what you want. And if, for instance, Razor is encoding things and you actually want them to display in their raw format, Razor has a method for that, HTML raw. You put this around your output and it will prevent any kind of encoding for HTML. One other thing I want to draw your attention to while we're on the subject of encoding is sometimes when you're using AJAX and JavaScript, you'll get data back in your AJAX that, if you were to process it in your page, could really create some havoc. This is a problem right now, especially as applications are being more AJAX-driven and more dynamic with JavaScript. It can be pretty easy for someone to fill out a form and put in actual AJAX instructions that could delete your database tables or whatever. You have a method to deal with this situation, ajax.javascript string encode. And if you put this around things that you either send to AJAX or get back from AJAX that might contain harmful characters, this will make sure to encode those characters so people can't include malicious JavaScript in the AJAX and it won't run against your AJAX code and do bad things. So these are all ways that Razor gives you to make sure that characters aren't getting into your HTML or your JavaScript, for that matter, that will mess up your view. So I'm here looking at the home controller, the default home controller that comes with the default MVC project when you start one up. And you'll notice here in the index action, it sets a string to the view bag. And this will actually display in the index view right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some text in here that might be problematic. You know that in this view, this is going to be displayed between H1 tags. So let's say I wanted to, make this red or bold or something that really made it stand out, So I think just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to put emphasis tags around this text. So I've got actual HTML tags that are going to be processed through my Razor code. Now by default, this HTML is going to be encoded. So when I start this up, and you look here, what it did is it went ahead and encoded the problematic characters. So they show up as actual HTML tags. Now if that's the behavior I want, that's great, because it'll do this for ampersands, it'll do this for less than signs, it'll do this for quotation marks and apostrophes, anything that might screw up HTML displays. And normally when I'm displaying text, that's what you want. But what if I actually wanted these to be HTML tags? I did not want them to be processed in any way. I wanted them to be interpreted just like regular HTML. Well, what I want to do there is I want to use a bit of Razor code around the message HTML raw. When I put that around the message, this will stop the default Razor encoding. And now you see that HTML has been interpreted as actual HTML in the page and not parsed out as characters. So this is a great way if you're going to dynamically interject HTML into your pages. HTML raw is a really good tool to have in your toolbox because it keeps it from being encoded. Razor can be used not just with little inline code nuggets, but can also be used with code blocks for more complex code. Maybe you have several different lines of code that you need to be executed. Well, you can actually use code blocks in that case. We use it for more intensive logic than just a little inline blurb here or there. Generally speaking, we use the curly braces to delimit the block. And so if you've coded in C# or some other C derivative language, you're used to this. In fact, even JavaScript does this. You use the curly braces to mark off your block of code, and we do this in Razor as well. There are certain kinds of statements where these are not necessary, like for very short if statements or very short for loops, where you don't have a lot of conditionals going on. these situations are common enough that you do not need to put them in your Razor code in order for them to work. One thing I do want to caution you about, though, is you want to make sure your code blocks are still related purely to display. Sometimes code blocks can be a code smell when it comes to Razor. If you're executing a lot of Razor code to arrive at something, make sure that all you're doing is worrying about displaying data that's already there, and you're not doing a lot of things like crazy formatting or conditional logic or things like that might more properly belong in a view model or a controller or something else that can actually play around with the data. So here I am looking at a page that displays a list of dogs that I pull from the model. And what I want to draw your attention to is down here at the bottom we have a code block. Okay, this is a little bit more elaborate than just displaying something in line as kind of a one-shot little blurb. What I'm actually having to do is loop through a list of dogs and then display characteristics of those dogs. So as you can see here, I've got my Razor delimiter, I've got my for each loop, okay, standard for each code for every item that's in this collection, and then I've got my curly brace. And in between that curly brace and my closing curly brace is my code block. This will actually execute for every iteration in the for each loop. Now, something that's interesting is notice that I can freely intermingle HTML and Razor code inside of this for each block, and the parser's smart enough to figure it out. It's smart enough to know the difference between HTML that's going to be repeated over and over and Razor code that's going to get executed over and over. So code blocks can be a really useful tool, especially if you want to do things like, let's say, for every other table row, I wanted that row to be gray, so I might put in extra Razor code in this code block to check to see what row I'm on. It's probably not the most efficient way to do that, but you get the idea. I can keep adding Razor code in this code block if I have more extensive conditions or more things I want to do. Just keep in mind, though, that as you add to your code blocks, you want to make sure that all your code blocks are doing is controlling display. You don't want to be doing any kind of logic or operations on the data or anything like that. But as long as you're doing that, then code blocks can be really useful for more elaborate uses of the view.